My name is Achilles. Tonight I would like to speak to you with my own voice, not with that of the poets. I was a warrior, but first and foremost I was a man.
Many remember my deeds, my weapons, my fury, but few remember the heart that beat beneath my armor.
Make yourself comfortable. Let your breathing calm down, and allow me to tell you my story as a man.
Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself transported back nearly 3,000 years to a time when the Mediterranean Sea sparkled under the ancient sun, when bronze weapons gleamed in warrior hands, and when the gods themselves walked among mortals, shaping destinies with their divine touch. Picture the shores of Troy, where the greatest war in mythological history raged for 10 long years, where heroes fought and died for glory that would echo through eternity. Among all these legendary figures, one name stands above the rest, burning like a meteor across the night sky of history, brilliant, beautiful, and tragically brief. This is the story of Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, whose very name has become synonymous with both invincible strength and fatal vulnerability. In the tapestry of Greek mythology, few threads shine as brightly or as tragically as that of Achilles. Born of a union between the mortal world and the divine realm, he embodied the eternal human struggle between the desire for a long, peaceful life and the burning need for glory that transcends death itself. His story is not merely one of battles and bloodshed, though he excelled in war beyond any mortal who came before or after. Rather, it is a deeply human tale of love and loss, of friendship and fury, of choices made and prices paid. The ancient Greeks saw in Achilles not just a warrior to admire, but a reflection of their own struggles with mortality, honor, and the meaning of a life well lived. From the moment of his conception, Achilles was marked by destiny, wrapped in prophecies that would guide every step of his brief but blazing path through the world. The fates had woven his thread with both gold and shadow, creating a life that would burn twice as bright but half as long as ordinary mortals. Every choice made by those around him, from his sea goddess mother to the kings who sought his aid in war, was colored by the knowledge of what he was meant to become and what price he would ultimately pay. Yet within this framework of fate, Achilles carved out moments of genuine humanity, of deep friendship, of overwhelming grief, and ultimately of a rage so pure and terrible that it would reshape the very course of the Trojan War. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the life of this extraordinary figure, from his divine origins to his prophesied death, from his hidden childhood to his final, fateful battle. We will walk the shores where he played as a child, climb the mountain where he learned the arts of war and healing, sail with him across the wine-dark sea to Troy, and stand witness to both his greatest triumphs and his most devastating losses. This is not just a story of ancient times, but a timeless exploration of what it means to be human, to face impossible choices, and to leave a mark on the world that endures long after we are gone. The divine origins and the prophecy that changed everything. The story of Achilles begins not with his birth, but with a prophecy that shook the very foundations of Olympus. Thetis, a sea nymph of extraordinary beauty and power, had caught the attention of the mightiest of the gods. Both Zeus, the king of Olympus, and his brother Poseidon, lord of the seas, desired her for their bride. In any other tale, this might have led to a divine competition or conflict, but the fates had other plans. Through the Titan Prometheus, or perhaps through the wisdom of Themis herself, a prophecy came to light that would alter the course of divine and mortal history alike. It was foretold that Thetis would bear a son who would grow to be greater than his father, a child whose glory would eclipse that of his sire. For Zeus, this prophecy struck at his deepest fears. He had himself overthrown his father Cronus to claim the throne of Olympus, just as Cronus had overthrown his own father Uranus before him. The cycle of sons surpassing fathers was written into the very fabric of divine succession, and Zeus had no intention of becoming its next victim. The thought of a son who might one day cast him down from his throne was unbearable. Poseidon, too, recognized the danger in fathering such a child. The brothers, who had competed for so much throughout their immortal lives, found themselves united in their decision to step back from their pursuit of Thetis. But what to do with a sea goddess whose very womb carried the promise of greatness? The solution was as clever as it was cruel. If Thetis could not marry a god without threatening the divine order, then she must marry a mortal. Any son born of such a union would indeed be greater than his father, but a mortal father could be surpassed without shaking the cosmos. The gods chose Peleus, a worthy but mortal king of the Myrmidons in Thessaly, to be Thetis's husband. Peleus was no ordinary man, having sailed with Jason on the Argo in search of the Golden Fleece, but he was still mortal, and that was what mattered. Thetis, proud and divine, did not accept this match willingly. When Peleus came to claim her as his bride on the advice of the gods, she transformed herself into fire, into water, into a raging lioness, and finally into a serpent, each form more terrible than the last. But Peleus had been instructed by the wise centaur Chiron to hold fast no matter what shape she took, and so he did, his mortal hands never loosening their grip despite the pain and terror. Eventually, exhausted and perhaps impressed by his determination, Thetis consented to the marriage. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis was an event unlike any other, celebrated on the slopes of Mount Pelion with all the gods in attendance. The muses sang, Apollo played his lyre, and the Graces danced while divine guests bestowed magnificent gifts upon the couple. Poseidon gave the immortal horses Xanthus and Balius, who would one day carry Achilles into battle. Chiron presented a mighty ash spear cut from the slopes of Mount Pelion itself, which only the strongest of heroes could wield. The celebration should have been perfect, a moment of harmony between the divine and mortal realms, but even the greatest celebrations can carry the seeds of future sorrow. For there was one goddess who had not been invited to the wedding, Eris, the goddess of discord and strife. Furious at this slight, she arrived uninvited and cast among the celebrating gods a golden apple, upon which were inscribed the words, "For the fairest." This simple act would set in motion a chain of events leading to the judgment of Paris, the abduction of Helen, and ultimately the Trojan War that would define Achilles' life and death. But on that wedding day, as Peleus and Thetis joined their hands in marriage, none could foresee the full extent of what was to come. They only knew that from this union would come a child destined for a greatness that would shine like the sun and burn out just as quickly. The making of an invulnerable warrior. When Achilles was born to Thetis and Peleus, his mother looked upon her infant son with a mixture of boundless love and crushing sorrow. For she alone among the wedding guests had the gift of prophecy, inherited from her grandfather, the shape-shifting sea god Nereus. She knew what the fates had decreed for her beautiful boy, that he would face a choice no mother would wish upon her child. Either he would live a long life in obscurity, growing old peacefully but forgotten by history, or he would achieve eternal glory as the greatest warrior of his age but die young on the fields of Troy. The prophecy was as clear as it was cruel, and Thetis, divine though she was, could not change what the fates had woven. But if she could not change destiny, perhaps she could cheat it. Thetis resolved to make her son invulnerable, to give him a divine protection that would allow him to achieve his destined glory without paying the ultimate price. The methods she employed have been told differently across the ages, each version reflecting the desperate love of a mother trying to save her doomed child. In the earliest tales, Thetis would place the infant Achilles in the divine fire each night, burning away his mortality bit by bit, and then anoint him with ambrosia during the day to heal and strengthen what remained. Night after night, she performed this agonizing ritual, each time bringing him closer to true immortality. But Peleus, mortal and unable to understand the divine nature of his wife's actions, discovered her one night holding their son in the flames. In his horror and ignorance, he cried out and rushed to save what he believed was his child being murdered. His intervention broke the spell at the crucial moment, leaving the transformation incomplete. Some say it was Achilles' heel that remained mortal because it had not yet been touched by the divine fire. Others claim that in her frustration and sorrow at Peleus' interference, Thetis abandoned both husband and child, returning to her palace beneath the waves, though she would never truly abandon her son, watching and intervening from afar throughout his life. The more famous version of Achilles' near invulnerability, the one that has echoed through millennia, tells a different tale. In this version, Thetis took her infant son to the river Styx, the dark river that forms the boundary between Earth and the underworld. The waters of the Styx were said to have the power to convey invulnerability to any who were immersed in them. Holding her baby by his tiny heel, Thetis dipped Achilles into the black waters, ensuring that every part of his body was touched by the river's power. The sacred waters flowed over his skin, hardening it to the strength of divine armor, making him impervious to any weapon forged by God or man. Yet in her desperate grip, in that one small spot where her thumb and forefinger held him secure against the terrible current of the Styx, the waters could not touch him. That heel, that single, small, insignificant heel, remained mortal, vulnerable, human. Thetis either did not notice this oversight or believed such a small vulnerability would never matter. After all, what enemy would think to strike at a heel in the heat of battle? What arrow could find such a tiny target amid the chaos of war? But the fates are not so easily cheated, and what seems insignificant often carries the weight of destiny. Whether by fire or water, whether complete or flawed, Achilles emerged from his mother's efforts as something between mortal and divine. He would grow to possess strength beyond normal men, speed that made him seem to fly across the battlefield, and skin that turned aside bronze and iron as easily as cloth turns aside the wind. Yet he remained mortal enough to feel pain, to love, to grieve, and ultimately, to die. This duality, this existence between two worlds, would define everything about Achilles. He was too divine to live a normal life, too mortal to escape death, forever caught between the world of gods and men. Education of a hero, under the wise centaur Chiron. After the dramatic events surrounding his infancy and Thetis' departure to her underwater palace, young Achilles needed guidance, education, and care that his mortal father alone could not provide. Peleus made a decision that would shape the boy into the warrior he was destined to become. He took his extraordinary son to Mount Pelion in northern Greece, to the cave of Chiron, the wisest and most noble of all the centaurs. Unlike his wild brethren, who were known for their violence and uncontrolled appetites, Chiron was civilized, learned, and just. He had already trained many of Greece's greatest heroes, including Jason, who led the Argonauts, and Heracles himself. Now he would take on, perhaps, his greatest student. Chiron was no ordinary teacher, and his cave was no ordinary school. The centaur, immortal and ancient, had accumulated knowledge from the dawn of civilization. His cave, high on the sacred mountain, was filled with scrolls of wisdom, herbs for healing, weapons for war, and musical instruments that could soothe the most savage heart. Here, young Achilles would spend his formative years far from the courts of men, learning not just how to fight, but how to live, how to think, and how to understand the world in all its complexity. The education Chiron provided was as comprehensive as it was demanding. Each dawn, Achilles would rise to practice the arts of war. The centaur taught him to wield every weapon known to Greek warriors: the sword, the spear, the bow, and most importantly, the great ash spear that had been Chiron's wedding gift to Peleus. This spear was so massive and heavy that no ordinary warrior could even lift it, but in young Achilles' hands, it sang through the air like a bird in flight. Chiron taught him not just the mechanics of combat, but the philosophy of warfare, when to fight, when to show mercy, how to read an enemy's intentions in their stance and movement, how to inspire men to follow him into the very jaws of death. But Chiron knew that a true hero needed more than just martial prowess. In the afternoons, when the sun was high and the mountain peaceful, he would teach Achilles the healing arts. The young warrior learned to identify every herb and plant on the mountain, to know which could heal wounds, which could ease pain, and which could bring sleep to the troubled. He learned to set bones, to clean and bind wounds, to brew medicines that could save lives. This knowledge would serve him well in the years to come, not just for himself, but for his companions in arms. The irony was not lost on Chiron that he was teaching the art of healing to one destined to bring so much death into the world. Music, too, was part of the curriculum. Chiron taught Achilles to play the lyre, to sing the old songs of heroes and gods, to understand rhythm and harmony, not just as entertainment, but as a way to touch the divine part of the human soul. In the evenings, as the sun set behind the mountains, the cave would fill with music as teacher and student played together, their melodies carrying across the valleys below. These moments of peace and beauty would become precious memories for Achilles in the dark days to come, reminders that life held more than blood and glory. Perhaps most importantly, Chiron taught Achilles the nature of excellence itself, what the Greeks called arete. This was not just skill or strength, but a complete virtue that encompassed courage, honor, justice, and wisdom. The centaur would tell stories of heroes past, analyzing their choices, their victories, and their failures. He would pose ethical dilemmas to his young student, forcing Achilles to think beyond the immediate to the eternal, to consider not just what would bring victory, but what would bring honor. Through these lessons, Achilles developed the code that would guide him through his short life, a fierce sense of personal honor that would prove both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. The hidden prince of Skyros. As Achilles grew from boy to youth, his divine beauty and extraordinary abilities became impossible to hide. Stories of the young prince who could outrun horses, who could hurl a spear through 3 shields, who could sing like Apollo himself, began to spread throughout Greece. These tales reached the ears of Calchas, the great prophet of the Greeks, who saw in his visions the approaching storm of the Trojan War. More importantly, he saw that Troy could not fall without Achilles, that the young son of Peleus and Thetis was essential to Greek victory. But he also saw the price of that victory written in blood and tears. When Thetis learned that the Greeks were gathering their forces for war against Troy, her maternal terror returned in full force. She knew that if Achilles joined this war, he would never return. The prophecy was clear on this point. If her son went to Troy, he would achieve the eternal glory he was destined for, but he would die young, falling before the war's end. The divine sea goddess decided to take desperate action to save her son from his fate. If the Greeks could not find Achilles, they could not take him to war. If he never went to Troy, he would never die there. Thetis came to Achilles, now a young man of extraordinary beauty with his long, golden hair and perfect features that reflected his semi-divine nature. She convinced him, through tears and pleas that would move even a heart of stone, to come with her to the island of Skyros, where King Lycomedes ruled. Her plan was as desperate as it was clever. She would disguise Achilles as a maiden, hiding him among the king's daughters where no warrior would think to look for him. The greatest warrior of the age would become just another girl in the women's quarters, safe from the recruiters who scoured Greece for heroes to fight at Troy. Achilles, out of love for his mother and perhaps curiosity about this strange adventure, agreed to the deception. Thetis dressed him in the finest women's clothing, taught him to walk with smaller steps, to speak in a softer voice, to sit and stand as women did. She gave him the name Pyrrha, meaning the red-haired one, after his distinctive golden-red locks. To King Lycomedes, she presented her disguised son as a young woman seeking sanctuary, and the king, whether fooled by the disguise or complicit in the deception, welcomed Pyrrha among his daughters. For months, perhaps even years, Achilles lived this strange double life. By day, he moved among the women of the court, learning their ways, their conversations, their daily routines. He became particularly close to Didamia, the most beautiful of Lycomedes' daughters, and their relationship soon transcended mere friendship. Despite his disguise, or perhaps because of the intimacy it forced upon them, Achilles and Didamia fell deeply in love. In secret, away from prying eyes, they were married after the custom of the time, and from their union came a son, Neoptolemus, who would one day follow his father's footsteps to Troy. But fate is not so easily avoided, and the Greeks desperately needed their greatest warrior. Odysseus, the cleverest of all the Greek kings, learned through his own sources that Achilles was hidden on Skyros. The master of stratagems devised a plan to reveal the hidden hero. He came to the court of Lycomedes disguised as a merchant, bringing gifts for the king's daughters, beautiful clothes, jewelry, perfumes, and mirrors. But hidden among these feminine treasures, Odysseus had placed a sword and shield of magnificent craftsmanship, weapons that would call to the warrior's soul, hidden beneath silk and jewels. The revelation and the choice of glory. The scene in the court of Skyros, when Odysseus arrived, must have been one of controlled tension beneath a veneer of normalcy. The supposed merchant spread his wares before the gathered daughters of Lycomedes, and they flocked to examine the beautiful gifts, chattering excitedly over fabrics and gems. Achilles, as Pyrrha, stood among them, maintaining his disguise with practiced ease. But when his eyes fell upon the weapons that Odysseus had cleverly placed among the feminine treasures, something stirred within him that no disguise could suppress. Different sources tell different versions of what happened next. In some tales, Odysseus had arranged for his companions to sound a battle trumpet and clash swords outside the palace, simulating an attack. While all the real maidens fled in terror at the sound of war, Achilles instinctively grabbed the sword and shield, his warrior nature overcoming years of careful disguise in an instant. He stood ready to defend the palace, his stance and grip on the weapons revealing him immediately as no maiden but a trained warrior of exceptional skill. In another telling, it was simply the sight of the weapons themselves that betrayed him. While the other girls admired jewelry and selected perfumes, Achilles was drawn inexorably to the sword, testing its weight and balance with the unconscious expertise of one who had been trained by Chiron himself. Odysseus watched with satisfaction as the supposed maiden handled the weapon with a familiarity that no true woman of that era would possess. The disguise falling away not through force, but through Achilles' own irrepressible nature. When his identity was revealed, Achilles did not attempt to maintain the deception. Perhaps he was relieved to drop the pretense, to stop hiding from his destiny. Standing before Odysseus and the assembled court, he transformed before their eyes from Pyrrha, the maiden, back into Achilles, the warrior, his bearing changing, his presence filling the room with an almost tangible power. Didamia wept, knowing that she was losing her husband to a war from which the prophecies said he would never return. Their infant son would grow up without a father, carrying only stories of the man who chose glory over a long life with his family. The choice that Achilles faced in that moment was the same one that had haunted him since childhood. His mother had made the stakes clear to him from the earliest age. He could remain hidden, live a long life in obscurity, see his son grow to manhood, grow old with Didamia, and die peacefully in his bed, remembered by few and celebrated by none. Or he could take up the sword, sail to Troy, and win immortal glory that would echo through the ages, but at the cost of his life while still young. The prophecy allowed no middle ground, no clever interpretation that might grant both glory and longevity. Standing there in the court of Skyros, still wearing women's clothes but holding a warrior's weapons, Achilles made his choice. He chose glory. He chose to be remembered. He chose a brief life that would blaze like a comet across history rather than a long existence that would fade into obscurity. It was a choice that defined not just his own fate, but the very concept of heroism in Western culture. The idea that some things are worth more than life itself, that glory and honor can transcend mortality. The Myrmidons, ant warriors of absolute loyalty. With his decision made, Achilles prepared to join the Greek expedition to Troy, but he would not go alone. As the son of Peleus, he commanded the loyalty of one of the most fearsome military forces in all of Greece, the Myrmidons. These warriors from Thessaly were legendary even before they followed Achilles to Troy, their very origin story setting them apart from ordinary soldiers. The name Myrmidon means ant people, and their creation myth explained both their name and their extraordinary characteristics as warriors. According to legend, the Myrmidons originated on the island of Aegina, where Zeus had taken the nymph Aegina and fathered a son named Iacchus, who would become Achilles' grandfather. When Hera, in her jealousy, sent a plague that killed all the inhabitants of the island, Iacchus found himself a king without subjects. In desperation, he prayed to his father Zeus, and as he prayed, he watched ants moving in perfect formation up the trunk of a sacred oak tree. He asked Zeus to give him subjects as numerous and industrious as these ants. Zeus answered his prayer in the most literal way possible, transforming the ants into humans who retained the characteristics of their former forms. These ant people, the Myrmidons, were unlike any other warriors in Greece. They moved with perfect coordination, never breaking formation, never questioning orders, working together with a unity that seemed almost supernatural. They were tireless in battle, able to fight for hours without rest, and utterly fearless in following their commander's orders. Like ants, they were builders as well as fighters, able to construct fortifications and siege works with remarkable speed and efficiency. Their armor was dark, often described as black or brown, making them appear even more ant-like as they swarmed across the battlefield. When Peleus had been exiled from Aegina after killing his brother, he took a contingent of Myrmidons with him to Thessaly, where they settled in the region of Phthia. There they flourished, becoming the core of Peleus' kingdom and, eventually, the inheritance of his son Achilles. These warriors had known Achilles since his birth, had watched him grow, had heard the stories of his training under Chiron. Their loyalty to him was absolute, not just the obedience of soldiers to a commander, but something deeper, almost religious in its devotion. As Achilles prepared to sail to Troy, 50 ships were readied, each carrying 50 Myrmidons, making a force of 2,500 of the finest warriors in Greece. But these numbers alone do not convey their true value. Each Myrmidon was worth several ordinary soldiers in battle, their coordination and discipline making them a force multiplier on the battlefield. When they fought as a unit under Achilles' command, they were virtually unstoppable, cutting through enemy lines like a blade through cloth. The Myrmidons were equipped with the finest armor and weapons that Thessaly could provide, but what truly set them apart was their unwavering loyalty to Achilles. When he fought, they fought with a fury that matched his own. When he withdrew from battle, they withdrew with him, no matter the consequences. They were extensions of his will on the battlefield, multiple bodies animated by a single purpose. This unity between commander and soldiers would prove crucial in the battles to come, but it would also mean that Achilles' personal grievances would affect not just himself, but the entire Greek war effort. The voyage to Troy and the early years of war. The gathering of the Greek fleet at Aulis was one of the great spectacles of the ancient world. Over 1,000 ships assembled, carrying the greatest warriors, kings and heroes of Greece. There was Agamemnon of Mycenae, the overall commander of the expedition, bringing 100 ships. His brother Menelaus, the wronged husband whose wife's abduction had sparked the war, led 60 ships from Sparta. Odysseus brought 12 ships from Ithaca. Diomedes led 80 from Argos, and the great Ajax commanded 12 ships from Salamis. Among all these legendary figures, Achilles stood out, young, beautiful, and deadly, leading his 50 black ships filled with the dreaded Myrmidons. But the voyage to Troy was not without its tribulations. At Aulis, the fleet found itself trapped by adverse winds, unable to sail. The prophet Calchas revealed that Artemis had been offended by Agamemnon and demanded a terrible price for allowing the fleet to sail, the sacrifice of Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. This event would create a rift between Agamemnon and Achilles that would have far-reaching consequences, for Achilles had been told that Iphigenia was to be his bride, only to discover she was to be sacrificed instead. Though he protested vehemently, the sacrifice proceeded, the winds changed, and the fleet sailed for Troy. The first landing at Troy was a moment of supreme danger. An oracle had declared that the first Greek to set foot on Trojan soil would be the first to die. As the ships approached the beach and Trojan defenders gathered, the Greeks hesitated, each hero brave but none eager to claim this dubious honor. Achilles, burning with eagerness for battle, would have leaped first, but Thetis had warned him of this specific prophecy. Instead, it was Protesilas who jumped first and was indeed killed almost immediately by Hector, Troy's greatest defender. Achilles followed seconds later, leading his Myrmidons in a charge that swept the Trojans from the beach and established the Greek beachhead. For 9 years, the war raged around the mighty walls of Troy. The city itself proved impregnable, its walls built by the gods themselves in ages past. Unable to breach the city's defenses, the Greeks instead ravaged the surrounding countryside, attacking and pillaging the allied cities that supported Troy. In these campaigns, Achilles proved himself the supreme warrior of the age. He personally sacked 23 cities, bringing back vast treasures and enslaved captives to the Greek camp. His speed, strength, and skill were unmatched, and the very sight of him on the battlefield was often enough to send enemies fleeing in terror. During these years, Achilles fought alongside and against many great heroes. He developed a deep respect for Ajax, the only Greek warrior who could match him in straight combat, though Ajax relied more on strength and defense while Achilles was all speed and aggression. With Odysseus, he shared a complicated relationship, respecting the Ithacan's intelligence, while sometimes frustrated by his tendency towards stratagem over direct action. Among the Trojans, he came to know his enemies well, particularly Hector, the eldest son of King Priam and Troy's greatest defender, though they had not yet faced each other in single combat. But it was not all warfare and bloodshed. During the quiet periods between campaigns, Achilles would play his lyre in his tent, singing songs of ancient heroes to his beloved companion, Patroclus. The two had been together since childhood, when Patroclus had come to Peleus's court as an exile after accidentally killing another boy. Slightly older than Achilles, Patroclus had accompanied him to Chiron's cave, had been with him through his hiding on Skyros, and now fought beside him at Troy. Their relationship was the deepest and most important in Achilles's. Life, whether viewed as passionate friendship or romantic love, it was the emotional center that grounded the otherwise tempestuous warrior. The Rage of Achilles and the Great Withdrawal. The 10th year of the war began with what seemed like a minor dispute, but would escalate into a crisis that nearly destroyed the Greek cause. After a successful raid on a nearby city, Achilles had taken as his prize a woman named Briseis, while Agamemnon had claimed Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo. When Chryseis' father came to ransom his daughter, Agamemnon rudely refused, sending the priest away with threats. In response, Apollo sent a plague upon the Greek camp that raged for 9 days, killing men and animals alike. On the 10th day, Achilles called an assembly of the Greek forces, demanding to know why the gods were punishing them. The prophet Calchas, after securing Achilles' protection, revealed that Apollo was angry because of Agamemnon's treatment of his priest and would not relent until Chryseis was returned without ransom. Agamemnon, humiliated at being forced to give up his prize, became furious. If he must lose his captive, he declared, then he would take another's prize as compensation. His eyes fell upon Briseis, and he declared he would take Achilles' woman as his own. The rage that erupted from Achilles at this pronouncement was volcanic. This was not merely about a woman, though Achilles had come to care deeply for Briseis. This was about honor, about respect, about the recognition due to the greatest warrior of the Greeks. Agamemnon, who rarely fought in the front lines, who led from the safety of his tent, was taking the prize that Achilles had won through his own blood and sweat. It was an insult that struck at the very core of the warrior code that Chiron had taught him. In that moment, Achilles' boom went to his sword, and he might have killed Agamemnon there in the assembly if the goddess Athena, visible only to him, had not appeared and stayed his hand. Instead of violence, Achilles chose something potentially more devastating to the Greek cause. He declared that he and his Myrmidons would no longer fight for the Greeks. Let Agamemnon and the others discover how much they needed Achilles when Hector and the Trojans came against them. He swore an oath by the scepter of authority that the Greeks would come to rue this day when they faced disaster without their greatest warrior. Then he stormed from the assembly, returning to his tent where he would remain, nursing his wounded pride while his comrades died. But Achilles went even further in his rage. He called upon his divine mother, Thetis, and asked her to intercede with Zeus himself. He wanted the Trojans to have victory after victory, to drive the Greeks back to their ships, to make them understand just how much they needed him. Thetis, though she knew this path would lead closer to her son's prophesied death, could not refuse his plea. She went to Olympus and reminded Zeus of a debt he owed her from when she had once saved him from a rebellion of the other gods. Zeus, bound by this obligation, agreed to favor the Trojans until the Greeks properly honored Achilles. The results were catastrophic for the Greeks. Without Achilles and his Myrmidons, the battlefield dynamics completely changed. Hector, no longer held in check by fear of Achilles, led the Trojans in assault after assault. The Greeks were pushed back, losing ground they had held for 9 years. Heroes fell one after another, wounded or killed, while Achilles sat in his tent, playing his lyre and singing songs with Patroclus, seemingly indifferent to the suffering of his former comrades. His Myrmidons, bound by loyalty, remained with him, though they chafed at the inaction, bred as they were for war. The embassy to Achilles and his rejection. As the situation grew desperate, with the Trojans threatening to burn the Greek ships and end the expedition in total defeat, Agamemnon finally realized his error. At the urging of Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, he decided to try to reconcile with Achilles. He assembled an embassy of the men most likely to influence the angry warrior: Odysseus, master of persuasion; Ajax, whom Achilles respected as a fellow warrior; and Phoenix, the old tutor who had helped raise Achilles in Peleus' court. They would go bearing not just apologies but magnificent gifts: 7 tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 cauldrons, 12 horses, 7 women skilled in crafts, and most importantly, the return of Briseis untouched. The embassy found Achilles in his tent with Patroclus, playing his lyre and singing of the glorious deeds of ancient heroes. He welcomed them warmly, for despite his anger at Agamemnon, he bore no ill will toward these friends. He had food and wine brought, and they shared a meal together before the embassy presented their case. Odysseus spoke first, with all his renowned eloquence, listing the gifts Agamemnon offered, appealing to Achilles' sense of duty to his fellow Greeks, and warning of the glory Hector was winning in his absence. Achilles' response revealed the depth of his disillusionment, not just with Agamemnon, but with the entire heroic code he had been raised to embody. He spoke of how he had fought harder than any other Greek, had taken the greatest risks, had won the most victories, yet received no more honor than those who stayed safely in their tents. He revealed that his mother had told him clearly of his 2 possible fates: Stay and fight at Troy and die young but glorious, or leave and live a long life in obscurity. Now, he declared, he would choose life. He would sail home in the morning, leave Troy and its war behind, and enjoy the years denied to those who sought glory. Phoenix spoke next, the old man weeping as he recalled raising Achilles from childhood, feeding him at table, teaching him to be both a speaker of words and a doer of deeds. He told the cautionary tale of Meleager, another hero who withdrew from battle in anger and returned too late to save those he loved. But even this emotional appeal could not move Achilles. He invited Phoenix to stay the night and sail home with him if he wished, but he would not fight. Finally, Ajax spoke, and his words were brief and pointed. He expressed his disgust that Achilles would abandon his comrades over a single woman when men had forgiven the murder of brothers for appropriate compensation. He accused Achilles of having a savage and unyielding heart. These words seemed to touch Achilles more than all of Odysseus's eloquence or Phoenix's tears, but still, he would not fully relent. He said he would not fight until Hector reached his own ships and threatened his own men. Until that moment, the Greeks were on their own. Patroclus, the price of pride. The embassy returned to Agamemnon with news of their failure, and despair settled over the Greek camp like a shroud. The next day brought fresh disasters as Hector led the Trojans in their most successful assault yet. They broke through the Greek wall, fought their way to the ships, and Hector himself seized a torch to set the fleet ablaze. From his tent, Achilles could see the smoke rising, could hear the clash of bronze and the cries of dying men, yet still he did not move. His pride, his wounded honor, held him fast even as catastrophe unfolded before his eyes. It was Patroclus who finally broke the stalemate, though at a cost no one could have foreseen. Unable to bear watching their comrades being slaughtered, he came to Achilles with tears streaming down his face. He begged Achilles to return to the fight, but when that failed, he proposed an alternative. Let him, Patroclus, wear Achilles' distinctive armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle. The Trojans, thinking Achilles had returned, would retreat in fear, giving the Greeks time to regroup. Achilles, moved by his companion's distress and perhaps seeing a way to help without compromising his own stance, agreed to this plan. As Achilles armed Patroclus in his own divine armor, crafted by Hephaestus himself, he gave strict instructions. Drive the Trojans from the ships, save the Greek army from immediate destruction, but go no further. Do not pursue the Trojans to the walls of Troy. Do not seek glory beyond what was necessary to save their comrades. Achilles knew that if Patroclus went too far, he would face dangers that even divine armor could not protect against. But he also knew his friend's nature, brave, eager to prove himself, always living slightly in the shadow of the greater warrior. The appearance of what seemed to be Achilles on the battlefield had exactly the effect Patroclus had predicted. The Trojans, who moments before had been on the verge of total victory, fell back in terror. Patroclus and the Myrmidons, eager for battle after so long idle, struck like a thunderbolt. They drove the Trojans from the ships, across the plain, killing many great warriors. Patroclus himself fought like a man possessed, or perhaps like a man trying to prove he was worthy of the armor he wore. 3 times he charged the walls of Troy itself, and 3 times Apollo himself had to beat him back, the gods striking him with divine force. But Patroclus, drunk on success and the glory of battle, forgot Achilles' warnings. He pursued too far, pushed too hard, reached too high. Apollo, protector of Troy, decided enough was enough. The god came up behind Patroclus, invisible, and struck him between the shoulder blades with such force that Achilles' helmet flew from his head, and the divine armor fell from his body. Stunned, defenseless, Patroclus was first wounded by Euphorbus, a Trojan warrior, and then Hector arrived to deliver the killing blow, driving his spear through Patroclus' stomach. As he lay dying, Patroclus prophesied Hector's own death at Achilles' hands. warning him that his victory would be short-lived. Hector stripped Achilles' armor from the body and put it on himself, an act of both triumph and desecration. The fighting over Patroclus' corpse was fierce and prolonged, with Ajax and Menelaus finally managing to carry it back to the Greek camp while others held off the Trojans. When the body was brought to Achilles' tent, the sound that emerged from the great warrior's throat was scarcely human, a cry of grief and rage that carried across the battlefield and made both Greeks and Trojans pause in their fighting. The grief that shook the heavens. The grief of Achilles over Patroclus was cosmic in its scope and intensity, a sorrow so profound that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. When the news reached him, when he saw the body of his beloved companion carried into his tent, Achilles fell to the ground, tearing at his hair, pouring dust and ashes over his head, his divine beauty marred by the physical manifestation of his anguish. His cry of lamentation was so terrible that his mother Thetis heard it from her palace beneath the sea and came rising from the waves with all her sister Nereids to mourn with her son. For Achilles, this loss was more devastating than any wound he could have suffered in battle. Patroclus had been his other half, the person who knew him best, who had shared his childhood, his training, his exile, his glory. Whether their love was that of brothers, friends, or lovers, it was the defining relationship of Achilles' life. Now Patroclus was gone, and worse, he had died wearing Achilles' armor, fighting Achilles' battle, because Achilles had been too proud to fight himself. The guilt mingled with the grief, creating a toxic mixture that would drive Achilles to actions that violated every rule of civilized warfare. Thetis found her son prostrate with grief, ready to die himself rather than live without Patroclus. She reminded him of the prophecy that if he killed Hector to avenge Patroclus, his own death would soon follow. But Achilles no longer cared about living. What was life without Patroclus? What was glory without someone to share it with? He had chosen pride over friendship, and now friendship was gone forever. He would kill Hector, he swore, and he welcomed the death that would follow. At least in the underworld, he might find Patroclus again. But first, he needed new armor, since Hector now wore his own. Thetis, recognizing that she could no longer save her son from his fate, went to Olympus to commission new armor from Hephaestus, the divine smith. The god, who owed Thetis a debt for sheltering him when he was cast from Olympus, created armor unlike anything ever seen before or since. The shield alone was a masterwork that depicted the entire cosmos, with scenes of peace and war, marriage and funeral, harvest and festival, all the experiences of mortal life that Achilles would soon leave behind. When Thetis brought this armor to her son, it blazed with divine light, and the mere sight of it filled the Greeks with hope and the Trojans with dread. Before returning to battle, Achilles formally reconciled with Agamemnon, though it was clear his heart was not in the ceremony. Agamemnon returned Briseis and offered his gifts, but Achilles barely acknowledged them. Such prizes seemed meaningless now. All that mattered was vengeance. All that mattered was making Hector pay for taking Patroclus from him. The rage that had previously been directed at Agamemnon now had a new target, and it would not be satisfied with anything less than blood. The Aristia of Achilles. Divine fury unleashed. When Achilles returned to the battlefield, it was not as a mortal warrior, but as an avatar of destruction itself. The gods themselves had to intervene to prevent him from taking Troy that very day. For in his grief-fueled rage, he seemed capable of overturning fate itself. He carved through the Trojan ranks like a scythe through wheat, his spear finding victim after victim, his sword painting the earth red with blood. The Trojans fled before him in absolute terror, many drowning in the river Scamander as they tried to escape his fury. So many bodies did Achilles throw into the Scamander that the river itself, a god in its own right, rose up against him, offended by the pollution of its waters with corpses. The river god attacked Achilles directly, trying to drown him in its waters, and it took the intervention of Hephaestus, sending divine fire to battle the water to save the raging hero. Even the gods were taking sides now, with those who favored Troy trying to stop Achilles and those who favored the Greeks clearing his path. The battlefield became a cosmic arena where divine powers clashed over the fate of one mortal man, driven mad by grief. Achilles showed no mercy, taking no prisoners, accepting no ransoms. When Lycaon, one of Priam's sons whom Achilles had previously captured and sold into slavery, fell before him, begging for his life, reminding Achilles of their past encounter, Achilles killed him without hesitation. His response was chilling in its nihilism. Patroclus was dead, and he was a better man than Lycaon. Achilles himself would soon be dead. Death was coming for everyone, so why should Lycaon be spared? This was not the honorable warrior Chiron had trained, but something darker, more primal, grief and rage personified. The Trojans were driven back to their city walls, and most managed to get inside before Achilles could reach them. But one figure remained outside, standing before the Scaean gates. Hector, Troy's greatest defender, prince of the city, killer of Patroclus, stood waiting. His parents, Priam and Hecuba, called from the walls, begging him to come inside to not face Achilles in his divine fury. His wife Andromache was not there, did not know her husband was about to face death incarnate. But Hector's honor, his sense of responsibility as Troy's champion, held him in place. He had killed Patroclus. Now he must face Patroclus's avenger. The duel of fates, Achilles and Hector. As Achilles approached, blazing in his divine armor, running with the speed that had earned him the epithet swift-footed, something unexpected happened. Hector, the brave prince who had never fled from battle, who had stood against the greatest Greek warriors for 10 years, looked upon Achilles in his fury and felt fear. This was not a man approaching, but something more terrible, a force of nature, death itself given form. Hector's nerve broke, and he ran, fleeing along the walls of Troy with Achilles in pursuit. 3 times around the mighty walls of Troy they ran, watched by armies on both sides, by gods above, by fate itself. It was not cowardice that made Hector flee, but the recognition of something beyond mortal comprehension in Achilles' rage. As they ran, Zeus himself held up his golden scales, weighing the fates of the 2 heroes. Hector's side sank down, indicating his doom, and Apollo, who had protected him so often, abandoned him. In his place came Athena, disguised as Hector's brother Deiphobus, convincing him to stand and fight, promising to stand beside him. Emboldened by what he thought was his brother's support, Hector stopped running and turned to face Achilles. He tried to make a pact that whoever won would return the other's body for proper burial. But Achilles, consumed by his need for vengeance, rejected any such civilized agreement. There could be no pacts between them, no more than there could be pacts between lions and men, between wolves and lambs. One of them had to die, and die now. The combat itself was brief but intense. Hector threw his spear first, and his aim was true, but the divine shield of Achilles turned it aside. When he turned to get another spear from his brother, he found no one there. Athena had vanished, and Hector knew he had been betrayed by the gods, that his death was upon him, but he did not beg or flee again. Drawing his sword, he charged Achilles, determined to die gloriously. Achilles, who knew every piece of armor Hector wore because it had once been his own, saw the one vulnerable spot where the collarbone meets the shoulder. His spear flew true, piercing Hector's throat, bringing the Prince of Troy crashing to the ground. As Hector lay dying, he made one last plea, asking Achilles to return his body to his family for proper burial. But Achilles' response was inhuman in its cruelty. He wished he could eat Hector's flesh raw, so great was his hatred. Dogs and birds would feast on Hector's corpse, he swore, and no amount of ransom would change that. Hector used his dying breath to prophesy Achilles' own death, telling him that Paris and Apollo would kill him at the Scaean gates. Then the greatest defender of Troy breathed his last, and his soul fled to Hades. The desecration and the plea of a father. What followed Hector's death violated every rule of civilized warfare, every principle of honor that warriors lived by. Achilles stripped Hector's body, then pierced his ankles and threaded leather straps through them, tying the corpse to his chariot. In full view of Hector's parents, wife, and all of Troy watching from the walls, he dragged the body around the city, Hector's head bouncing in the dust, his divine beauty destroyed. The wailing from Troy's walls was terrible to hear, but Achilles was deaf to everything but his own grief and rage. For 11 days, Achilles continued this desecration. Each dawn, he would drag Hector's body 3 times around Patroclus' funeral mound, then leave it lying face down in the dust. But the gods, appalled by this violation of sacred custom, intervened. Apollo preserved the body from decay and damage, while Aphrodite anointed it with ambrosia. No matter how Achilles abused it, Hector's corpse remained intact, as if waiting for the proper rites that would allow his soul to rest. During this time, Achilles organized elaborate funeral games for Patroclus, the grandest ever seen. There were chariot races, boxing matches, wrestling, foot races, competitions in archery, and spear throwing. Achilles gave magnificent prizes from his vast store of treasure, honoring his friend's memory in the traditional way, even as he dishonored his friend's killer. The contrast between his treatment of Patroclus and Hector could not have been starker. One elevated to almost divine status in death, the other denied even basic human dignity. Finally, Zeus could bear no more. He sent Thetis to Achilles with a command, not a request, to release Hector's body for ransom. Even Achilles could not defy the king of the gods. Meanwhile, Zeus sent Iris to Troy to tell Priam to go to Achilles with ransom for his son's body. It was an almost suicidal mission for an elderly king to go alone into the enemy camp to face the most dangerous warrior alive who had just killed his son. But Priam's love for Hector overcame his fear. Guided by Hermes in disguise, Priam made his way through the Greek camp unseen until he reached Achilles'. Tent, the old king entered and did something that stunned Achilles. He knelt and kissed the hands that had killed his son. He invoked the memory of Achilles' own father, Peleus, asking Achilles to imagine how Peleus would feel if Achilles' body was being desecrated. For the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles truly saw another person's grief, recognized a pain that matched his own. The two men wept together, the old king and the young warrior, both mourning sons lost to the war. In that moment of shared humanity, Achilles' rage finally broke. He raised Priam to his feet, had Hector's body washed and dressed for burial, and even held back his myrmidons for 11 days to allow Troy to properly mourn and bury their prince. It was the last act of mercy Achilles would ever perform. The death of the greatest warrior. After Hector's funeral, the war continued, and Achilles threw himself into battle with complete abandon, knowing his own death was approaching. He fought and killed Memnon, king of the Ethiopians, who had come to aid Troy with an army as formidable as the Greeks. He faced the Amazon queen Penthesilea, and in the moment he struck the killing blow, their eyes met, and he fell in love with her, too late. Each victory brought him closer to his fate, but he no longer tried to avoid it. Without Patroclus, life had lost its savor. He was merely going through the motions until death claimed him. The circumstances of Achilles' death vary in different tellings, but the core elements remain consistent. Paris, the prince whose abduction of Helen had started the war, faced Achilles in battle. Paris was no great warrior, preferring the bow to close combat, often mocked by both sides for his lack of courage. But on this day, his arrow flew true, guided by Apollo himself, who had never forgiven Achilles for killing Troilus, one of Apollo's favorites, and for his various acts of hubris against the gods. The arrow struck the one vulnerable spot on Achilles' body, his heel, where his mother had held him when dipping him in the Styx. Some versions say this happened during battle, others that it occurred when Achilles came to a temple to negotiate or even to marry Priam's daughter Polyxena. But the result was the same. The poison on the arrow, or simply the shock of finally being truly wounded after a lifetime of invulnerability, brought the great warrior down. As he died, Achilles might have thought of the prophecy, of the choice he had made, of the glory he had won, and the price he had paid. The battle over Achilles' corpse was as fierce as any in the war. Ajax carried the body, while Odysseus fought off the Trojans, and they managed to bring their fallen comrade back to the Greek camp. The mourning for Achilles surpassed even that for Patroclus. Thetis came from the sea with her sister Nereids, and their divine lamentation could be heard across the battlefield. The funeral games for Achilles lasted for days, and his ashes were mixed with those of Patroclus in a golden urn, the two friends united in death as they had been in life. Legacy, the eternal echo of a brief life. The death of Achilles marked the beginning of the end for Troy. Without their greatest warrior, the Greeks had to rely on cunning rather than strength, leading eventually to the stratagem of the Trojan horse. But Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, also called Pyrrhus, came to Troy to take his father's place. He had inherited Achilles' fighting prowess, but not his occasional mercy, becoming one of the most brutal killers during Troy's final sack. In him, we see what Achilles might have become without the humanizing influence of Chiron's teaching and Patroclus' love. The impact of Achilles on Western culture cannot be overstated. He became the archetype of the warrior hero, brilliant, brave, and doomed. His choice between a long, obscure life and a short, glorious one has resonated through millennia, inspiring countless others to choose achievement over safety, fame over longevity. The phrase, Achilles' heel, has entered virtually every language influenced by Greek culture, a metaphor for the fatal flaw in something otherwise perfect. In literature, Achilles has never ceased to fascinate. Homer's portrayal in the Iliad remains the definitive version, showing him not as a simple brute, but as a complex character capable of great tenderness and terrible rage. Later, Greek playwrights explored different aspects of his story, and Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid added their own interpretations. In modern times, writers from Shakespeare to Madeline Miller have found new ways to tell his tale, each generation discovering something relevant to their own time in this ancient story. The philosophical implications of Achilles' story have been debated for millennia. Is glory worth dying for? Can rage ever be justified? What is the price of pride? The ancient Greeks saw in Achilles both the best and worst of humanity, the pursuit of excellence taken to its logical extreme. He achieved the immortality he sought, his name known thousands of years after his death, but at such a cost that we must wonder if he would make the same choice again. Psychologically, Achilles represents the warrior archetype in its purest form, but also the devastating effects of grief and the destructive power of unchecked rage. His reaction to Patroclus' death, what we might now recognize as complicated grief or even post-traumatic stress, led him to actions that violated his own moral code. In his story, we see how loss can transform love into hate, how grief can become a kind of madness, and how the desire for vengeance can consume everything noble in a person. Conclusion: the immortal echo. As our journey through the life of Achilles comes to an end, we're left to contemplate the profound questions his story raises about the nature of heroism, the price of glory, and the meaning of a life well lived. Achilles achieved exactly what he set out to achieve: eternal fame, his name remembered long after kingdoms have fallen and gods have been forgotten. Yet the cost of that achievement, the friends lost, the mercy abandoned, the humanity sacrificed on the altar of rage, asks us to consider whether some prices are too high to pay. The genius of the Greek myth-makers was that they didn't give us simple heroes to admire, but complex characters to contemplate. Achilles is simultaneously the greatest warrior and a cautionary tale about the warrior mentality taken too far. He shows us both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human cruelty. In his divine armor, he seems like a god, but in his grief for Patroclus and his eventual mercy to Priam, he is utterly, heartbreakingly human. Perhaps that's why Achilles continues to fascinate us 3,000 years after his story was first sung by wandering bards. In him, we see our own struggles with mortality, our own desires for recognition and meaning, our own capacity for both great love and terrible rage. His choice between a long, quiet life and a short, glorious one is a choice we all face in different ways. Between safety and achievement, between contentment and ambition, between being forgotten and being remembered. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of bronze-clad warriors on the plains of Troy, of a young man running along the beach with divine horses, of a mother's tears falling into the wine-dark sea. Perhaps you'll hear the echo of a lyre playing in a tent while the world burns outside, or see two old enemies weeping together over the bodies of their lost sons. These images have haunted humanity's collective dreams for millennia, and they will continue to do so as long as we struggle with what it means to be human, to be mortal, to live and die in hope that something of us remains. Achilles chose glory over life, and in doing so, he achieved a kind of immortality. Every time his story is told, every time someone uses the phrase that bears his name, every time a young person chooses achievement over safety, Achilles lives again. He remains forever young, forever beautiful, forever tragic, the eternal warrior frozen at the moment of his greatest triumph and his approaching doom. In the end, perhaps that's the truest victory of all, not to live forever, but to create something, a story, a legend, a name, that outlasts the flesh and touches hearts thousands of years in the future. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the greatest stories ever told. If you enjoyed exploring the life of Achilles and want to hear more tales from ancient mythology, from the heroic to the tragic, from gods to mortals, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Each week we dive deep into these timeless stories, finding new meaning in ancient wisdom. Until next time, sweet dreams, and may your own choices lead to a life worth remembering, whether it be long or short, quiet or glorious.